Imagine you have not eaten properly in 2 days. The animals have moved on, the fruit is gone, the roots nearby have already been dug up, and the only food left is a field of grass. Not wheat, not crops, wild grass. The seeds are smaller than your fingernail. Most are trapped inside hard husks. Some have already fallen into the dirt, and collecting enough for one meal could take most of the day. You cannot simply chew them. They are dry, tough, and mixed with insects, dust, and tiny stones, but hunger gives you no better option. So someone kneels down and does something that makes no sense. They place the seeds between two rocks and crush them into powder. Then they pour water into the dust. Now the food looks even worse. It has become sticky mud. They flatten it beside the fire. The edges begin turning black. Smoke rises. Everyone watching probably thinks the entire day's food has just been ruined. Then someone breaks it open. The middle is warm, soft, and easier to eat than the seeds it came from. You are not looking at porridge. You are not looking at roasted grain. You may be watching one of the first pieces of bread ever made. But here is what makes this discovery almost impossible. The people making it were not farmers. They had never planted a field. They had never domesticated wheat. They were hunter-gatherers making bread-like food roughly 14,400 years ago, around 4,000 years before agriculture became established in that region. So bread did not begin because humans learned how to farm. Humans were grinding wild grass, mixing dough, and baking flat cakes before farming even existed. And that creates a much bigger mystery. Why would people already surrounded by meat, roots, nuts, and wild plants spend an entire day making one small piece of food that disappeared in minutes? What made bread worth repeating? And did humans begin growing grain because they needed more food, or because they had already invented one food they could no longer live without? The answer begins in a field of wild grass, when one starving human picked up two rocks and accidentally started changing the future of the entire species. The first important step was not baking. It was noticing that grass contained food at all. Wild cereals do not advertise themselves like fruit. Their edible seeds are small, dry, and protected by husks. Mature heads can shatter, scattering grain before collectors arrive. Harvest too early and the kernels are undeveloped. Arrive too late and much of the crop is gone. Yet ancient foragers learned the calendar hidden inside these grasses. They learned where dense stands appeared, when the heads ripened, and which plants were worth carrying home. But harvesting was only the beginning. The grain still contained chaff, dirt, stones, and insects. People had to dry it, free it from husks, remove lighter debris, and inspect what remained. Why perform all this labor? Because seeds offered one advantage that meat and ripe fruit often could not. They waited. Dry grain could remain edible after the plant died. It could be carried, stored against bad weather, and processed later. A successful hunt gave food immediately. Grain gave choices. But storage did not make raw grain pleasant. The seed coat resisted chewing, so humans recruited a tool older than bread itself: stone. A pounding stone could crack grain. A flat stone beneath it could stop the fragments from escaping. Repeated blows turned hard kernels into coarse meal. Grinding with pressure and motion made the particles smaller still. At Ohalo II, beside the Sea of Galilee, researchers recovered wild cereal starch from a grinding stone used around 23,000 years ago. An oven-like hearth stood nearby. That does not prove a loaf was baked there. Other preparations remain possible, but people were transforming wild grass seeds long before the earliest surviving bread-like crumbs. The next discovery may have looked like failure. Dry meal scatters. Add water and it changes completely. At first the mixture becomes porridge. More flour or less water creates paste. Press that paste together and particles that once rolled separately begin behaving like one object. Now the food can be shaped. The mixture can now be flattened on a heated stone, placed near embers, or cooked against another hot surface. Heat then performs a transformation teeth alone cannot. Starch absorbs water and softens. The paste firms into something that can be lifted, carried, and shared. The outside dries and browns. Thousands of seeds become one food. No single person needed to understand the chemistry. They only needed to remember the sequence. Grind, add water, shape, heat. That sequence was simple enough to repeat, but difficult enough to improve for generations. Too little grinding left hard fragments. Too much water made the mixture spread. Too little made it crack. Thick cakes could burn outside while remaining wet inside. The first recipe existed in hands, not numbers. Someone learned the feel of useful dough, judged heat without a thermometer, and recognized when to turn the cake. Children watched. Mistakes became instructions. That repeatability mattered because bread concentrates uncertainty into a sequence humans can control. A hunter cannot order an animal to appear. Rain cannot be commanded. Fruit ripens on its own schedule. But once grain has been collected and stored, people can decide when to grind it, how much water to add, and when to place it near heat. The result may fail, yet the failure teaches something visible. A cracked cake needs more water. A burnt edge needs less heat. A raw center needs a thinner shape. Bread rewarded memory, precision, and shared instruction reliably in a way that many wild foods did not. Then, in northeastern Jordan, a few mistakes survived. At Shubayqa I, Archaeologists excavated fireplaces used by Natufian hunter-gatherers. Among the ash were 24 charred food fragments. Under magnification, researchers found structures consistent with bread-like products made about 14,400 years ago. Some fragments contained wild einkorn, others included starchy club-rush tubers. The makers were combining different wild plant ingredients into prepared food. The surviving pieces were small, black, and easy to overlook. Fire had ruined them as meals but preserved them as evidence. Their pores and plant tissues revealed a flat, probably unleavened or only slightly aerated product. It may have resembled a thin flatbread more than a modern loaf. But the most revealing clue was not its shape, it was its rarity. Wild cereals were not among the most common plant foods found at the site. Producing fine flour from them required considerable work. Club-rush tubers also needed processing. This suggests bread-like foods may not yet have been ordinary daily staples. They may have been special. Perhaps people prepared them for gatherings or special meals. Archaeology cannot identify the occasion, the bakers, or what they called the food. But difficult food often survives socially before it becomes economical. Humans prepare difficult dishes because taste, hospitality, identity, and ritual matter. Bread may have begun not as starvation food, but as cuisine requiring skill and cooperation. That possibility changes the usual story of agriculture. For generations, the neat version sounded obvious. First, humans domesticated wheat, then farmers harvested abundant grain. Then somebody invented bread. Shubayqa reverses that order. People were making bread-like products roughly 4,000 years before the agricultural way of life became established in the region. Bread did not require domesticated cereal fields to appear. It required wild plants, grinding technology, water, controlled heat, knowledge, and enough motivation to perform the work. This does not prove bread caused farming. Humans cultivated plants for many reasons, including climate, storage, risk, population, and changing mobility. Grain also became porridge, drinks, and roasted food. But bread could have increased the value of cereal plants. Once wild grain became a desirable transformed food, a dense stand of grass was no longer only something to gather. It became something worth revisiting, protecting, managing, and eventually planting. Imagine returning to the same patch each season. You favor heads that hold grain longest. Seeds fall near camp, or are scattered in disturbed soil. Useful kernels are stored and later become seed for another year. No council announces the invention of farming. Tiny preferences repeat. Wild wheat normally benefits when its mature head breaks apart and scatters seeds. But plants with unusually tough, non-shattering heads keep their kernels attached. Nature makes those plants worse at dispersing themselves. Humans make them better at being harvested. Collectors disproportionately take the heads that remain intact. If those kernels are later planted, the non-shattering trait spreads. Over many generations, selection begins redesigning the plant around human hands. Einkorn became one of the earliest domesticated wheats around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. Genomics shows a complex history, not one clean moment in one field. It was a long negotiation between plants, people, landscapes, and repeated choices. Agriculture then changed bread more dramatically than bread may have changed agriculture. Fields concentrated grain near settlements. Storage protected harvests. Permanent houses held heavy grinding stones and ovens. People could bake for larger groups. Bread moved from rare production toward dependable food. The economics reversed. For a mobile hunter-gatherer, a bread-like cake could represent hours of gathering and processing scattered wild plants. For a farmer surrounded by harvested grain, the same technique transformed stored calories into portable meals. And once dough was made repeatedly, another invisible partner became impossible to avoid: microbes. Yeasts and lactic acid bacteria live on grain, tools, hands, vessels, and in the surrounding environment. Leave flour and water together, and fermentation may begin. Microorganisms consume sugars and produce acids, aromas, and gases. In dough capable of trapping gas, bubbles make the mixture lighter. The first fermented dough may have been forgotten beside a hearth. It may have smelled strange or swollen unexpectedly. Someone could have discarded it or cooked it. If the result was softer, more flavorful, or easier to chew, the accident became worth repeating. Again, no surviving crumb identifies the first deliberate leavened loaf. Fermentation could have emerged independently in many places. The Shubayqa fragments do not prove raised bread. What mattered was not seeing yeast. It was preserving behavior. A piece of old dough could seed a new batch. A mixing vessel could carry microbes from yesterday into today. People could maintain a living culture without knowing that it was alive. Bread became a partnership between human memory and organisms invisible to human eyes. Farming communities kept expanding the possibilities. Different grains produced different textures. Cooks added pulses, seeds, oils, fats, fruits, or nuts. Dough could be thin, thick, fresh, dried, or fermented. By the late Neolithic, communities in Upper Mesopotamia used large ceramic trays and domed ovens. Wear, plant traces, and residues indicate that some held thick cereal products enriched with fat or oil, cautiously compared to focaccia. Experimental replicas produced loaves weighing several kilograms. Bread was no longer a small disk cooked beside an open fire. It was becoming architecture. Ovens controlled heat. Trays controlled shape. Permanent settlements supported equipment too heavy to carry and recipes tied to particular communities. The same grain and water technology also blurred into other foods. Use more water and ground cereal becomes gruel or porridge. Allow a liquid mixture to ferment and it can move toward beer. Use less water, trap gas, and bake it, and the result moves toward leavened bread. The boundaries were not invented all at once. People explored a spectrum. A failed dough could become porridge. A wet mash could ferment. Grain, water, microbes, and heat opened several culinary worlds. Bread then began reorganizing society. Dry grain could be measured, stored, taxed, traded, guarded, stolen, and redistributed. Bread converted stored grain into portions that workers, travelers, soldiers, children, and guests could receive. As villages became cities, baking could be centralized. Mesopotamian records later listed breads by flour, size, ingredients, and method. Loaves became wages and offerings. A ruler did not need to own every meal. He needed to control the fields, storage rooms, ovens, and people turning grain into food. This was far beyond the intention of the first bread makers. They were solving a physical problem. How do you turn tiny hard seeds into something worth eating? Stone solved size. Water solved cohesion. Fire solved digestibility and structure. Fermentation later changed flavor and texture. Farming solved scale. Administration turned scale into control. Bread's deepest trick was that the finished food hid the plant from which it came. A roasted root still looks like a root. Roasted meat still looks like an animal. Bread looks nothing like grass. Thousands of seeds disappear into flour. Water becomes invisible. Microbes act without being seen. Heat builds a new texture. Separate ingredients lose their identities and become one object. Humans were no longer only cooking nature. They were dismantling it and rebuilding it. That made bread both technology and symbol. A loaf could welcome a stranger, feed workers, mark a ritual, or reveal who controlled the harvest. But none of that was visible in the first blackened cake. Return to the field. You are hungry. The animals are gone. The roots are exhausted. Wild grass moves in the wind around you. One seed means almost nothing. 1,000 seeds are still difficult to eat, so you gather them, clean them, place them between two stones. The upper stone moves across the lower one again and again. Hard kernels become powder. Water turns powder into paste. Hands flatten the paste. Fire hardens the surface. Then the cake breaks open. It is warm, soft, and unlike anything the landscape produced by itself. People eat it. Most evidence disappears immediately. A few crumbs fall into the fire and burn. Those crumbs remain buried for more than 14,000 years. When archaeologists finally recover them, they do not find the name of the baker, the first recipe, or proof that bread alone created agriculture. They find something more honest. Evidence that hunter-gatherers had already crossed the crucial line. They knew grain could become flour. Flour could become dough. Dough could become a food worth making again. So how did humans invent bread? Not through one accident, one genius, or one perfect loaf. They invented it through thousands of small observations. Which grass ripens first? Which stone grinds best? How much water holds the mixture together? Where heat cooks without burning? How long dough can rest? Which old batch makes the next one rise? Which seeds remain attached long enough to harvest? Bread appeared before farms because invention often comes before infrastructure. Desire comes before supply. Humans first discovered a food they wanted. Then, slowly, they changed plants, landscapes, settlements, and their own lives to make that food dependable. The starving person in the field did not know any of this. They only knew the seeds were too hard, hunger was growing, and 2 stones could change the problem. But once those stones began moving, grass would never be only grass again.